Here we are with Lawrence Duncan, musician and longtime member of the Drum Brothers, and Billy Maxwell, cultural anthropologist, and we are having a bone broth tea time discussion about cultural appropriation.
And where did that tea come from? It came from China. So I guess we didn't take it, we bought it. But
I suppose.
I gotta say, I'm an alien to cultural appropriation. I know the kind of general concept, but the definition of culture I grew up with is culture is shared learned habits. That's kind of a generic microcosm. So shared learned habits, it's not quite as flamboyant as sometimes it gets portrayed. But that's what culture is, shared learned habits. So everybody shares these habits.
Well, it seems to me that then once a people or a culture is colonized or otherwise converted, that sharing of those habits tend to decline until the point is reached where it's no longer remembered what there is to be shared. We were talking a little bit before we sat down about how even now, after 300 or so years, the Native Americans on this continent are beginning to are showing signs of losing a lived or vital connection with that culture. And if you think back to the 1,000 or so or more years ago that our ancestors were colonized, I find myself wondering, well, what would it be like for Native Americans in 1,000 years in terms of remaining connected and deeply in the culture that their ancestors were?
Well, I kind of grew up with culture's plastic, and it changes, and it doesn't stay the same, and it changes every generation, even in the old days. Now, that's the aspiration and knowledge of what I had. But what we're seeing here in North America is colonization before colonial, before European. And that's part of what I grew up with is Mayan colonization, Aztec colonization, and humans do that. Humans colonize other humans and destroy what they had and take it away. There is, I think, a misunderstanding of misappropriation. I think it's a misuse of the term of what's going on. It's taking a habit somebody else has, like, for instance, pipe smoking. And, culture can be as simple as how do you hold your pipe. And it can be as formal as how do you hold your pipe and you're communicating with the spirits. But it's alien to me of how you own culture and how you own your language. And that's what the aspirations of cultural appropriation is. And I think when I grew up and it got jammed into you in the Native community, well, you don't do that. That's not what you do. Mm-hmm. And that's what culture is. You don't do that. That's taboo. That's bad manners. And you're not supposed to talk about manners for some reason today, and I'm a miss. I have not a clue as to what's going on in the world. But there's a dialogue of cultural appropriation, and I think because language was taken away, culture was taken away by the dominant culture, that people who are left with what they have assume that they owned it, and you don't. You cannot own language, you cannot own culture. It is a tool for use. Now, when you're in your daily routine habits, it is just reality. It is what traps you in is reality. Our English language is a trap. It expands how we understand the world. I pick up the book and I move it over here. But if I was to do that in Lakota, if I was to do that and describe it in the language, the concepts I use, greatly, I'm handicapped. I only speak one language, and I'm not even good at that. I mean, English is not, it's my first language, but it's not a good language for me. Is like in Japanese, your language, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is your language shapes who you are and how you think. It is your trap. whether you're whoever. And the fact that there's an understanding that all native culture has stayed the same would be an incredibly horrid myth. There's not a single culture in North America that stays the way it is. And maybe people think it is, but and in Chinese culture it's the same way. There may be core beliefs that hold tight, but there's a continuous, more that we look back into the past archaeologically through language, talking to older people, going through old transcripts. It's maybe bad manners for me to dress up like a native. Mm-hmm. It's culturally not appropriate. It's not manners. That's what I know is good manners. But there are ways that in culture you stop someone from behaving badly and breaking taboos. In the native community, when you break a taboo, and many times and around the world, the punishment is quite harsh, severe. Beheadings, finger cuts off, your house is burned. I mean, genuine repression. And for most of Montana, if someone breaks a major taboo, the threat is not that they're going to harm themselves, they're going to harm the community. Yeah. They have broken protocol with the spirits, they've broken protocol, and there's a hole, as he was talking about, that's a real concept. There's a hole being created, and something's going to fill that hole. It's not through guilt or even association. Something's going to fill that hole, and people are mortified as to what's going to be thrown into the hole because of this misaction. Yeah. And there's a big gap between native kids today, not all of them, but most of them, and the older generations that knew how the hole is formed and how the hole is going to get filled back up. And the horror story in native world is, oh my gosh, it's a form of gossip. It's not a pretty thing. It's a form of, it's a horror story. It really is. Yeah. And it goes on sometimes even today. I see it, of where somebody's done a misaction and someone in the community is going to pay.
Can I ask you something then?
Yeah.
So you were saying earlier, let's see if I can put this together.
About cultures not changing.
Or about cultures changing. Are these two things related? I mean, is that operative in what you're describing as, well, culture doesn't really stay the same over time, it changes? Does it have to do with what you're just talking about? Those changes?
It can. That can be gone away with. The expectation that the whole is gone because a kid came through boarding school and he's only known the King James Version of the Bible, and he's as alien to the whole. I thought that was a beautiful metaphor last night in the movie. Mm-hmm. That fits. I've not heard that ever before, but being in different native communities and seeing religious practices, I over the years have developed this thing of don't pray God's or the spirits are trying to kill you, and ultimately they will. So you're trying to compromise by praying of delaying the inevitable, but it is a joke inside talking to older guys. They avoid religion, native religion. They avoid owning a bundle. They avoid that because of the incredible amount of burden that's put down onto the individual. Yeah. Just the tribe owned the bundle. And it doesn't matter what bundle, just any generic religious bundle. It's like owning a battery in my world of understanding it. You own a battery. Well, you got to maintain and care that battery. Now, when you die, are you going to pass that battery on? And it comes with music. It comes with taboos. I've got friends that can't eat buffalo meat, and they're native on the plains. That's from not a bundle. That's from their own clan, and they still observe that. And yeah, they dress Western, but they're also very active speakers in their language, and they are not visible. They're hidden. And there are a lot of people in native communities like that. And then there's the people that always are out front talking, and you see them a lot, and they get a lot of attention. Yeah. And then there's an old saying in the Army, when somebody's climbing up the flagpole, you can see how much of their butt they have exposed. So there's a lot that's traditionally hidden in native world. Yeah. And I know from growing up in the 70s, the people I knew grew up in boarding school, and they had the white culture jammed down their throat, and they called themselves, and even in the 1930s and 40s, the missing generation, because you don't know how to take care of your kids.
Yeah.
You learned at a boarding school. I went to boarding school. That is not how you become a human being. That's how you become inhuman in a boarding school environment. There was one child in my boarding school, white guy. His parents dropped him off in the 6th grade, and he had no social, rubbing of the kitty or, hey, it's so good to see you, affection and love.
Yeah.
Every culture's got that in some way, and it was completely ripped out. And he had none of that by the 12th grade.
This is another thing that the subject of the film we watched last night, Griefwalker, is addressing in his school, the Orphan Wisdom School, that human beings aren't born, human beings are made.
Right. That's very well put. I thought he was very well grounded. I know there was the cultural appropriation sidetracking, but when people say that, it's code for me that they don't speak their language, they don't know their culture. Because if you really know your culture, you have to know it. I know Anglo culture better because I backgrounded against another culture. You can't know your culture by just being in it all the time. You have to know it by contrasting it with something.
And
then it's like, oh, now I see better, And that's why I got into anthropology. Oh, I see it better. I grew up with, I don't like my own culture. I want something better. Something's got to be better over the rainbow. And I think
you can know more about something by learning what it's not.
Right. Is and is not, or how much it is alike in humans. So I don't say I study the other, which is a thing in anthropology. I study another, because no matter what language, how complicated and removed, or how removed the culture is, no, that's another human being. And death is one of those things we're all linked. So your friend who's on the
Stephen Jenkinson.
Stephen Jenkinson, the fact that he's got the James Campbell Lifesaver collection of humanity tells me he's pretty well better grounded in European. And I don't think he's so much protesting against European as that he's in the natural world. And this is what humans behave like in the natural world with the culture that they have. But I also don't believe in praising all cultures. You don't know a culture until you know how to criticize it. And that comes from this contrast of one against the other. Now, do I dress like a Native American? No. And the reason is it's bad manners. It insults someone. Now, that is not the case like in the 70s. The motive for Native speakers to get a young white boy to come to a doings, is what we call ceremony, a doings, is to insult the kids that are not going. They're too busy watching TV. They're too busy going to McDonald's. They're too busy watching, sports to come to a Native event like Huckleberry Feast or a peyote meeting or what they should be coming to. And they have to, in the 70s, they would literally have to pay Indian kids to come to an event. And I associate with the Indian kids, actually, because I don't want to go to church 3 times a week. I can understand how they are trying to escape the same old. And everybody has that a little bit of, you want to escape what you grew up with. But we are here at this table, and I want to pass on what Forrest Casneboy told me, which I think is incredibly true for all humans and human culture. He's a Comanche code talker in World War II. There was one platoon of Comanche code talkers that worked the European theater. You don't hear about them, and I think all of them have died now. But Forrest said culture happens, and we were eating breakfast in Oklahoma. He says culture happens at the dinner table. I thought, wow, that's 1,000 miles an hour. He's like, you don't learn it from a book. You don't learn it in college. You don't learn it from anthropologists. He always called anthropologists suspicious characters. Because if you're going to learn something in a language, if you're going to learn something he did not separate religion, language. He said, you could be full-blood Comanche. In Comanche world, doesn't matter. If you're not here, speaking the language, in the community, if you're not active here, you're a relative far away. Yeah. It's face-to-face contact that counts. And in linguistics, we know TV might make an impact, but what really makes an impact is face-to-face communication. That's everything in human existence, as far as what I can narrow it down. But I know a lot, and I know a lot. I don't know a lot, and when I hear cultural appropriation, I can kind of understand where it's coming from, or the term and the concept. And I may be completely off track and unpopular, but it's not what I grew up with. And the people I grew up with who were completely, you would assume, immersed in their culture, whether it's Warm Springs in Oregon or Comanche in Oklahoma, they had criticisms of their own culture they got fed up with. That it was not all pretty. Mm-hmm. The Blackfeet here, the burdens of owning a bundle, the taboos that go with it. I've seen families break down over trying to maintain bundles because it makes the family economically broke. The tribe doesn't own it. It's not tribal property. It allows, in the case of beaver bundle, it allows the community to have access to the resources they have dominion over by markers within the landscape. And a friend of mine, Paul Raska, one of the things he did as a beaver bundle and anthropologist is he would go around and try to find those markers. I'll give you an example of one. Dr. Malouf here in Missoula, he's passed away since. The markers for the Salish, their territorial markers, are those painted rocks south on the Bitterroot. Huh. And there's a saying in Salish, at the top of our valley is the red paint. At the bottom of our valley is the red paint. And they're referring to the paint on the wall at red rock or painted rocks. Mm-hmm. And then Bear's Mouth is at the other end of their valley. And with the Blackfeet, it's the same way. You'll see these red marks, these streaks, and that allows the owner of the beaver bundle and the people that it serves to have dominion every year over the animals that are in the bundle in that area. Wow. And it is not just blank spirituality. It is your maintaining who you are with the resources you have. It's very much linked. And it's bigger than that. That's just a nutshell. Really? But it's still active. It's not dead and it's not gone away. And tribal government has nothing to do with it almost at all. Yeah. It's completely cut off from that.
Oh, Billy, it's inspiring, and what's another way to kind of stilling in a way for me to be able to sit across a table from someone who has this breadth and depth of understanding of culture and cultures as you do. I feel like I'd like to step back just a little bit to a question about it that I imagine, and I hope I know what I hope this is in some way accurate, about why to approach the question of the use of the phrase cultural appropriation as a kind of finger pointing thing, or a kind of an accusation that seems to be, to me, seems to be kind of why it's happening right now. And the question I'd like to wonder about,
lip pointing. It's bad manners to point. It's lip pointing.
It's lip pointing, but I'm also wanting to think about it as what is it a symptom of that's going on?
Emptiness. I think that's what I assume based on what I know. I see emptiness. Yeah. People are too caught up in everything that they see, and it's a human thing. Everything that you see is what makes you. And if people are on the internet or watching too much television, or they're disconnected from the natural world again, then you become a very weak person, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think people have an easy life in America. I see this over and over again. Many of the people I interviewed were World War II veterans from Native communities, and they saw PTSD in 3 years of combat in the Pacific, holy cow. And they saw a disconnect even then. of where people are in the industrial world, and their lives are relatively easy, and those are the ones that have the worst time with PTSD. And this comes to me through a Grove Oninen. His name was William Bill Shortman, and he was given Red Whip's bundle. As it turned out at the end of the interview, it ends up, oh my gosh, I'm interviewing Red Whip's grandson. And he came, proof of the bundle being active and powerful is, it was a otter bundle. It's a square parfleche. It's actually in the religious collections at Cody. Is Red Whip is one of the most notorious Grovant warriors of the 1800s. He never got a scratch, and he destroyed all of his enemies. I mean, it's unprecedented, really. This is his grandson, and his grandson inherited his bundle. Bill went 3 years of combat in the South Pacific and never got a scratch. Went through 15 ambushes with the Japanese, and he says, you know, it's really tough. He lived like a dog. And I was like, yeah, man, I can relate to what you're saying there. I haven't been in the military myself. And then his son, as further proof of the power of that bundle, went through Vietnam and didn't get a scratch. Philip Shortman, and got a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in Vietnam. Even though the bundle was not present, even though he didn't know how to sing the songs, even though he didn't know the proper etiquette of how you maintain it throughout the year, the power of the bundle just speaks in the success that they had in combat. And it was not known, I don't think, to the greater community that this is Red Whip's grandson. Yeah. He was hidden. And he was one of only 5 people that were the last Oninen speakers, Grovant speakers. And I'm even shocked today there's one left, because Teresa Langbull, she died in her later years, and she had with her a guy named Donovan, one of the Donovans, and he's a guy younger than I am, and he's really good at Grovant. It's a very difficult Algonquin language, and she really put the screws to him on how you enunciate stuff, and she was one of 5. Now, the problem Bill Shortman had with Grovant is simply the fact that if there's only 5 people that speak your language in the world, it's hard to maintain your language. You can't think in that mode. And these are 5 people who grew up, that was all they knew as kids, is Oninen, is speaking that language. So I've seen the language die right in front of me, and you know, what can you do? I mean, you know, it's already too late. I can barely do English myself.
Can we go back to language?
Yeah, sure.
What you're saying about it earlier, and one of the things that I can say about Stephen Jenkinson is he has a deep and abiding love for the English language. One of the first things that he suggests to people that decide to go to his learning house and, you know, try and come to terms with some of the things that he's talking about is get an etymological dictionary and start learning your language and learning the stories of the words in your language. And you know, there are, and he speaks of it as though it's something that there's so much that it has to teach us about who we are and these stories of these different words. One of the ways that he talks about it is, you know, and it reminds me of something you were saying earlier about the whole. And if you look at the story of a word and you discover, well, wow, at this point in time, the meaning really altered or even changed or even became the opposite of what it was before in terms of its meaning.
Meaning times, yeah.
And in those moments, you know, it behooves us to wonder at least about, well, what happened? You know, what was going on there? What was going on at that point?
There's a great breaking point in native world, everybody's world, in what the old world is and what the new world is. And it's simply getting electricity. And there's some great interviews with kids. They were kids at the time of the 30s when the electrification of Montana happened. Yeah. And they felt that their whole world had been turned upside down. as far as leisure time. And I lived without electricity for 4 years, and there's a lot of people. I'm not the only one that lives off grid, and you really do know what the contrast is and the struggle of life is when you don't have something like electricity. And I think that you definitely understand and appreciate better what you got. And with language, you take it for granted when that's all you know is one language, and you don't know the history. And I learned more as being an anthropologist in a sociolinguistics class about the way I speak English from Eastern North Carolina than I did my whole life living in Eastern North Carolina. It's like finally the pieces get put back together of where did that come from, because stuff happens and nobody kept track of it. Nobody wrote it down. And that's how culture does change, is just by human habit and situations changing. But to remove culture from language, from everybody I know that spoke many different languages around North America, that's death. It's like having the electric lights turned on. The light in the wood stove just went out.
Yeah.
Whew, that's mourning. That's grief.
Yeah.
That's grief. When a habit dies. So I worked at the Interpretive Center in Great Falls, and people are like trying to speculate how Lewis and Clark started the fire. Well, they don't write this down. They take it for granted. They write down things that are new to them: plants, the flowers, the language. Clark's trying to spell stuff differently because he's trying to capture the language, and he's disabled because he has English. It has a limited vocabulary, sound patterns. Mm-hmm. And you're talking to people, sailors, they talk like chickens clucking because they're doing glottal clicks. Well, forget it. You're never going to get that. And one of the guys I knew, one of my volunteers, he didn't have a question on how flint and steel is used, because as a child in the 1930s in southern Alberta, that was his responsibility as a 5-year-old: sharpen the knives and start the fire. And he did it because they couldn't afford matches. He was Mormon, and he would take his fire steel, he would take a charcoal out of the fire pit, he would put it right on the edge of a sharp rock and tap it, and he would maintain charcoal. They didn't even have wood, they had coal. He would maintain fire, and he didn't lose the habit. He just did it. And it was, to him, why would you write that down? That's common knowledge. And he didn't understand that that's completely gone, and he's one of the few people on earth that still does that. But language changes in much the same way. And language is the reality we're stuck with until we learn something different. I have a friend, Chuck has a friend, George DiGiorgio. He speaks 5 languages, and he can think at many different levels because it's 5. They're mostly European languages, but he got exposed. His mother was Araucanian, so there's something that didn't fit in to the 5.
Were you still there last night during the discussion when one of the participants in the discussion observed what she referred to as an accent in Jenkinson's speaking.
I think I was.
And I, I've been thinking about that a lot. Of course, part of what the discussion was tending toward at that point was this question of cultural appropriation. And I was interested in hearing the how does one acquire such a thing, such an accent. And as we're sitting here talking and I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, well, clearly a lot of learning and a lot of effort would go into that. I mean, it's like it's a major commitment to be able to speak Anishinaabe in the way that Jenkinson was in the film, and yet it wasn't observed or it wasn't thought of. It seemed, and I don't want to make. I really appreciated her contribution to the conversation, but I did find myself wondering. Why would it not be possible to also observe the effort and the time and the labor and the love that had to go into doing such a thing if you're, with your background not having anything to do with that? And you were talking about learning languages, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about this.
Well, usually an accent comes in before you're 18 years old. Once you're 18, something happens in the human brain and the switch goes off. If we get brain dead. So
maybe accent wasn't the right word for what she was asking about.
But that is a critical thing in speech. So my friend Don Price, he's fluent Lakota speaker, Sioux speaker. His mother was conservative from Standing Rock. He's one of only 3,000 people that are active Lakota speakers. And he doesn't just know words. He can tell you how to get to the bank and back, and a daily routine conversational language. He knows Old Speak. He doesn't know all the Old Speak, and very few people even in the 1930s did. But he's also active Hispanic speaker without an accent, and he did that as a kid. And some people have a better capacity for language, and it's usually people that pick up more than one language earlier in life before they're 18. And the accent, I'm not an official Anishinaabe speaker, but when I'm hearing people use a language, he seemed to have gotten it early in life. He was comfortable in saying what he said. He may not have had it spot on, but he wouldn't have been heavily criticized, I don't think, in most communities I know, just because the languages are so weak now. And what he was doing was pretty much going to the four directions with the tobacco and giving the offering. There's nothing you can throw a rock at or glue lip pointing against on that. I found his practice was, he's got Mongolian, he's got Anishinaabe, but I didn't think he was so much protesting against even European culture. It's just modern culture that's removed from nature. That was what my takeaway was. That there's nothing that I think it's wrong to say European culture doesn't have a way. And my point last night was, no, European culture, don't put it too far down the mark. It does. Yeah. And it's just that you don't know that part of it. So I really like the protest behind me with protest, which it kind of was. The women are like, the poems, the Yiddish women up there. And it's like, well, yeah, that's how most cultures express sorrow and joy all at one time. The marrying is the poetry, the music. Chuck and I were talking about this morning over coffee. I was telling him, when I worked in the fields as a kid, I started earning labor wages when I was 7 in tobacco fields. I kind of started late in my community. You're supposed to start working when you're 5. Child labor laws, oh, by the way, they don't exist in North Carolina in agricultural things. But black people, white people were all working out in the fields, and everybody sang. I mean, it was more common. And the people of my generation know. But older people, you catch them out, and they're just in a routine and working. Working and singing is a human thing. And it's something that's died, and it's literally from technology. It's literally that's a professional singer. You shouldn't be singing. Now, churches still maintain that, and black churches, white churches, of singing, but it's still formalized. It's not informalized. And when it's informalized, I think that's a big part of what I see it with my volunteers that were a generation before electricity came along. I'd see them out there working. We had 150 of them, so I had a lot of Anglo, Native, and black volunteers, and they would be singing as they're folding paper. I'm like, oh, I don't know. You've held a lot of hands of people passing away, but that generation from the 20s and 30s, they'd be folding paper, and there's a song going on in their head, or they're humming, and they have been edited from doing that, but that's a hardcore human thing around the world.
One of the phrases that's coming back to me is rhythm replaces strength. It certainly reinforces it, and it makes any kind of task easier to do if there's a rhythmic element to it. I haven't thought about this for a while, but I worked on an assembly line for a while up in Ronan, and putting tool packages together for the various hardware stores, drill bits and that kind of thing. And I worked on this one assembly line, and it had more than one. I was studying drumming and learning about being ambidextrous, and all that stuff and rhythms. And this one conveyor belt had more than one discrete rhythm going on. You could. It was polyrhythmic, the rhythms that were going on were polyrhythmic. And I found once I was clued into that, that I could use what the actual machinery was offering to me rhythmically, and I began to be able to, just move with that rhythm, and it was a piece of cake, and people were looking at me like, "Wow, what is that guy doing?" But
I noticed
what you're talking about.
I worked on a 40 John Deere tractor as a kid. Matter of fact, we still have that 40 John Deere tractor because it still works. It's a one piston thing.
Yeah.
Pop, 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 and that's your day all day long. It's pop, 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 pop. I can still reproduce it today. That's the language and the music I grew up with. Pop, 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 pop. And it's something. Music and singing and mourning and death and language and culture and habits. It's all beautiful, and at the same time, it's not all pretty in the past either. So I think getting the Pollyanna Disney World view of somebody else's culture is better. It's different, and it has value, and you see your own, I think, better by contrasting cultures. So am I stealing from other cultures? Well, if they own it, yeah, I guess I'm stealing. And but I think it's a human habit. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I dealt with this just recently on my group of about 3,400 people, where a woman really admired Apache puberty right dress tops, and I got banned by Facebook for my response because I was trying to be subtle, and I says, "Well, you'd be better off doing traditional Wichita women's dress than a puberty right dress. It's not appropriate because that's for a girl. She's gone through puberty, and it's like walking around in a when you have thing in I'm going to dress like a European. I'm going to dress when the Catholic girls come out with their dresses, the white thing. Right. Yeah, I wear that all the time as a 40-year-old woman. It's like, I don't know if I could do that. That's really cutting it there. But I said, you could dress like a Wichita if you have to dress like a native at some whatever rendezvous event. Mm-hmm. Well, traditional Wichita women go topless. And elderly Wichita woman I know, her granddaughters asked her, they're like, "Well, Grandma, can we want to do the traditional thing. We want to do the right thing." Well, she goes, "Well, it's pretty easy, and it's also not so easy." So there are these great 1860s images of Wichita women, and they got the attitude going on because they're Wichita. They don't give a darn who the photographer is. They're there to get their picture taken. Yeah. And, man, they've got silver on, and they're dressed to the hilt from the waist down, but the girls are out, and I got kicked off Facebook for 3 days for that. So Indian people that are kind of traditional in the group are kind of laughing because I showed breast, but somebody had the gall to put human fingers on there, and that's bad manners. You shouldn't do that. And if you're attuned to that, people are sensitive about the past in that way. And, Europeans are too. You don't see a lot of people celebrating lynching of black people any more than they do the crimes against humanity back then as well. But
what about the Halloween costumes that I was telling you about?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, that's just bad taste.
There was a couple in Idaho that was asked to leave the bar because they were dressed in some inappropriate Native American outfits.
And people have a right to do that. That's cultural maintenance thing. Every culture has cultural maintenance thing. The Puritans, if you fall asleep in church, they're going to knock you in the back of the head with a broomstick and whatnot. I've been hit many times with my father's, I think it's imprinted in the back of my head, NC State class ring. I think it was a ruby because it was red.
Really, should it remain the purview of the culture or representatives of the culture to do the chin pointing or the lip pointing when it comes to cultural appropriation? I mean, who's qualified? Who's really qualified to make those kinds of accusations?
I don't think in Native community traditionally or in modern way, it's whoever wants to. It's a human thing. And
within the Native community.
Yeah, there's a bad cartoon of tribal council opened up and the lip pointing began and it never ended. Humans, this is where it isn't that pretty to be human no matter what culture you got. When you know a culture inside out, it doesn't come out so good in the end. But In the old days, it would be more the elders and that sort of thing. It's like, oh, we've got a disgruntlement. Well, you better go to an older person and figure it out, or grandma, and get some advice and avoid that. But, the elder thing is kind of dropped off because people live alone now in America. And Native communities, too. Native people might have a higher percentage of families living together, but it's less as time's gone on. And people are more living alone. And so as a result, on Facebook, you get people Native and white and Chinese, and they're all... You won't see, I don't think, cultural appropriation in a Chinese community. They don't care. I mean, they'll laugh at it or whatever, but the idea, they're comfortable. In Native world, I think it's more expressed in that there's not a lot of options. They know how small it is in their world. Mm-hmm. You might have 3,000 active things for your whole culture.
Yeah.
And so for something like Chinese, they're pretty strong and comfortable, but there'll be a lot of finger pointing there, internally mostly. That's a European. Who cares about them? They're not a threat. In India, there's a lot of finger pointing internally, or they're not doing it right, or we don't like them over there because they're not, using the right curry or whatever. But it's going to happen. I mean, cultural appropriation, browbeating. Just think it's not as bad as in Saudi Arabia, where they use beheadings as a way of cultural maintenancing. And that's the term I grew up with in anthropology. Cultural maintenancing. It was the big word.
I'm very interested to hear this, but I'm also wondering about cross-cultural appropriation, cross-cultural pointing at another person like myself. So one person of European descent pointing to another person of
native descent
and accusing them of cultural appropriation from another culture yet.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm wondering. I mean, is it possible to even wonder about the appropriateness of such a thing?
Well, yeah, no, are you being appropriate? Who are you to judge? I think that's been in the Bible. Who are you to judge?
Yeah.
And so on my group, the way I handle that, there's not one answer, it's a myriad. In the case of the woman, I didn't make judgments on her for saying she admired and wanted to do an Apache puberty rite. I just tried to recommend another alternative if she's going to go in that direction, and not say no. And it's probably best for me to just say no. That would be easy, but I want her to see why no. If she understands why no, because a lot of times people will see something on the internet and they're out of the community. And again, this goes back to force, cast, and avoid. You have to be in the community. Mm-hmm. You have to be active speaker of the language. You have to be an active member of the face-to-face community. And you have to be a member of different associations. In his way of being Comanche. Now, was he Comanche bloodline? No, he's half Hispanic. His mother or grandmother or quarter Hispanic was an Apache captive. The Comanche have a very vast way of absorbing all other culture and taking it for their own use. Mm-hmm. And so is it appropriate? I think it's just an ongoing question of what's good manners. That used to be what I grew up with is, well, that's just bad manners. Are you being cultural maintenancing and judging someone else? Well, do you have good manners? Are you performing good manners? Can you deliver that without being offensive? Or do you be offensive when it's more important, say like the health of another person or somebody's being abused? Do you get more, do you start beheading at that point?
This absurd question just occurred to me. Is it cultural appropriation to have good manners?
I think it's universal to have good manners.
Yes.
And the cultural maintenancing comes from grandmother and your father or whoever saying you're not going to do that, And if that's lacking in someone's home. In Yamamano, there's a bad, funny, very true. Yamamano are known to be a very violent culture to anything other that's not Yamamano. Mm-hmm. And if somebody's got bad behavior, bad manners, the women would often say, well, isn't it sad that his mother didn't love him enough to breastfeed him? Boom,
Yikes.
boom, pow, boom. Now, my mother loved that. She's passed away, but she was a big advocate of breastfeeding. That's a basic human. That's a human thing. We're mammals, mammaries, you know. Now I get banned off Facebook for showing breast to express and try to interpret in a funny way, you know, cultural appropriateness or good manners, and I get kicked off Facebook. So I've kind of reduced my Facebook footprint as a result of that. But in Kiowa, I was just with Kenny Haragera. He came up and visited, and he said, this is kind of, again, funny stuff. Funny stuff passes better. He said, women own everything in Kiowa culture. They own the lodge, and this is very typical for North America, is matrilineal, matrilocal, women control it. It looks like they don't, but no, they really do. Mm-hmm. They own the buffalo teepee, they own the hides, they own the meat. The men are just there for window dressing, and it's very much that way, by the way, in a buffalo herd. Troy Westry's going to kill buffalo, and the bull, there is no such thing as a lead bull. They're just there for sex, and the cow, there's a lead cow. So you have to go to find out who the lead cow is. You want control of a buffalo herd. And native societies here on the plains mirror that in many ways. So there is a time in a man's life. I'm going to try to recapture what Kenny was just telling me in the hot tub. There's a time in a man's life when he's allowed to go and have a good time with his friends. That he's allowed to go out, enjoy himself, and be who he is with his pals, with his comrades. And that time is the time from when the stick goes into the water that it comes out and it dries. And your ass better be home before that stick dries. So you're with your buddies and somebody disappears in Kiowa. I thought it was hilarious. I told Kenny, that's gold, man. That's gold. Here, we got a stick. So we got it wet. They're like, where did he go? Well, his stick was drying. You know, had to run. Gotta go. And there's always gold in every culture that gets, you know, just washed away. And that's what you lose, you know. And what human doesn't want to associate to that, you know. So it gets underestimated. But like what Forrest says, you're at the dinner room table. The women own everything. They run everything. They're your mother. They have the breast. You get fed by them. And if that's broken off, then, oh my goodness, we have an orphan situation, which seems to dominate a lot of things. I'm disabled as far as knowing what to do with the orphans. So my background is I grew up with my grandmother, with my aunties. I grew up in an expanded family, and I'm European, on the land that we had been exiled to as terrorists around 1712. And I'm still on that. Well, I still have that land. So I didn't have a disconnect with my European past. I just wanted more out of it, and I eventually got it. So I am disabled. I've lived without a cell phone. I mean, I have a cell phone. I'm still not good at. Do you blow into them? Is that what you do with that? You blow into it? I'm not living in an area that had cell phone service, so I don't know how to do that. I'm not very good at faxes. And I've lived off grid and in the woods, and I'm a wild man. So I don't do well with relationships. It's not really worked out well this past generation of women. So I'm kind of looking more to the retirement homes for, a soulmate. Because that generation, I think, understands life a little bit better. I don't understand the life from women younger than I am. But I don't know why we're going in this direction. But face-to-face contact, is it appropriate? I don't know. We all have to kind of make it up as we go because we're all alone at home, unless you're fortunate enough to have a beautiful woman at home that has a wood stove. Mm-hmm. So,
I'd like to go back to this point that
your stick is dry.
Actually, the part about I was asked this question last night after the discussion. Someone I know was wondering about where the feminine fit into all this, and goddess type energy, or there was a question brought up about this and I'm really surprised at how, for me, your observation about human, what makes a human being, and this being breastfed connection, kind of seems to me really speaks to that question, in a very fundamental way.
My mother was criticized. So she's Republican, Eastern North Carolina, and politics is what politics is. But her role later in life was she was a large woman. She was very well blessed by the Lord. But when she would have a baby, it was often a joke that she could feed the whole pediatrics ward. She was quite the milker, and very much a component during the Dr. Spock bottle feeding era. Yeah. My parents spanked and they disciplined, and I think we still turned out pretty good because we were breastfed, so we're more resilient. But the woman's role is dominating. I mean, it's in the background maybe for what you might read of any particular culture, but it is what it is. They are the core of any culture, and without them, you got nothing. You got a bunch of guys that are lost in a foxhole. So women are the ones that pull it all together, and that it happens genetically or just biologically from having a child and the child bonding with the mother, just like it does in the animal world. It's no different. Now in our world, we are electrified, we have Wi-Fi, there's so much to sever us from what should be just common habit, and has been common habit for millennia. Mm-hmm. And that's where I see the orphan creation, and it's happening quicker, and it's magnifying and recreating quicker than the culture of European or Native American catch up to it. So the cheap, fast, and out of control is a bad thing. And I think that's one message I took away from the movie last night. Yeah. That the fear, anxiety, it's not just white people with that. It's a lot of people that are in the modern world. It is a byproduct of the modern world. I don't see it as much as a byproduct of the old world, no matter what the culture. I think every culture has a way of mourning grief and dealing with.
Well, there's this threshold, industrial, pre-industrial.
And I see it as more important now, older in my older life, because I've seen people who interacted before that and after that. And in my own world, I mean, I pack mules, I live with the mules, and there's a Nez Perce story Josiah Pinkham was saying at a conference I sponsored. And Josiah said, it's not really in books, but how the Nez Perce got horses was playing hand game around 1780s in Utah. And playing at Spanish Forks, they played hand game against the Utes who had these Mustangs and the mules, and they played hand game and won, and walked all the way back, or rode their horses all the way back, and that's how they got horse culture, playing hand game, gambling.
This is so fascinating. The questions are just jumping up for me. Now you have this background of cultural anthropology, and I had the privilege, it seems to me, of being able to read a series of documents from the early part of the 1600s, from the Huron relations that the Jesuits would write to their superiors about their experiences with the Huron.
In Canada.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if you've ever laid eyes on any of that.
I hadn't. That's not an area I've done much work in. I'm a little bit exposed to it with some friends and clients who are Iroquois, and I provide them with English cloth because that's the old trade thing for back in the Jesuit days, the English trade wool. It was the big marketing thing. So I try to reproduce that old stuff from Tudor Stewart. Yeah. That's why I don't know cell phone very much. I'm too busy. But to go back to horses. Horse culture, man, now your life has really changed, because here in North and South America, they don't have a lot of domesticated animals. You got dog, guinea pig, turkeys, alpacas, llamas, and that's it. Yeah. And that's why they don't have diseases that killed them when people from dirty Europe came over, which most of the diseases came from Asia, from chickens and pigs and all of that. Yeah. But when a culture gets horses, your humanity just got expanded to animals. They are part of your family now. And that happens in ranches here in Montana. It happens with your cat. You bond with your cat. You are cat culture. You are right here at this house. You're cat culture. So when the Nez Perce were taking off on their horses, they didn't quite know how to operate them. There's somebody following them. And this is 1780, not 1780s, I take that back, 1750s, 1760s, sometime in that time period. They jumped him and, who are you? And he signed language that his name is Juan. Well, the people who take care of Spanish horses are not the Spanish. The people who take care of Spanish horses are Moors. When the Nez Perce got horses, they got immediately horse culture. And he gave it all to them and taught them how to breed the horse, how to do everything, how to take care of the saddle, how to make saddles, how to spin out with a whirligig the rope. It all happened at one time, and people speculate, well, how did horse culture happen here on the Northern Plains? It happened in that moment. It was a momentary explosion. So the Moors from Northern Africa, for what we know, got to Idaho before anybody else that was European. So it's an African invasion in Idaho, and it made a quantum explosion. So if you look at horse gear today at Crow Fair in August, when the parade's being done, the only match to the model of everything that you see is North Africa. It's straight up. There is a man in Roundup who makes Moorish horse gear. They made such an impact here in the West because of the Spanish. They worked for the Spanish. There are Moorish communities in New Mexico and Arizona. But I maybe get sidetracked with that tangent. But it's the history of humanity. So do I need to go out and dress up my horse in Moorish horse gear? Well, people are so far removed on the reservation. If you did do that, they wouldn't know how to say I was culturally inappropriate. Because I love it when you have layers of history in one item, and people don't know the background of what got appropriated from what got appropriated from what got appropriated from what got appropriated, and it's nice to try to track that. I mean, it's great at cocktail parties anyway, I'll put it that way. But I think that's what makes life more interesting, is trying to track back, and that's the hope of the future, is trying to track back and make and do things. But I think ease and convenience has been the biggest poison in our culture, our world.
It just occurs to me that what stands in the way of more of what you're describing as learning, really, that learning in general, but specifically in this case about culture and how it's passed along and how it goes from one place to the next, is knowing. This idea that the huge, the main cost of learning is what you know.
Exactly. I thought that was very well stated.
Yeah,
it's very well stated. Can't take that away. But you can only act on what you know, what you don't. You can't act so much on what you don't know. And a lot of times people will act on what they fear, which is what they don't know. I still get. I've lived with grizzly bears a long time. And people are absolutely fascinated with grizzly bears.
Mystery.
The mystery of grizzly bears. And when you know there's no mystery, that if you act in this way, you will not have a problem. And if you don't act in this way, well, you're probably going to have a problem. And they're actually quite predictable. What's not so predictable is dealing with fire and hantavirus. Hantavirus is what kills Montanans. But if you look at Time Magazine did a triangle, and the greatest fear of most Americans is grizzly bears at the top. The least chance of any death or injury ever happening, even in Montana, is grizzly bear. What's going to kill you is what people don't care about. Cirrhosis of the liver, what kills them: cancer, stroke. The big killers and it's down there on the bottom of concern, and it's what's going to take you out. So when you to get back to what you were talking or what we had alluded to earlier on fat, my father and grandfather both fought the anti-fat thing. For them, fat, if you don't take in fat, you won't have a source of energy to do the manual work you have to do. And your worth as a human being in my community growing up is how hard a worker you are. It's not what you know or you went to school, it's how hard you work. And that, whether you're black or white, it doesn't matter. they judge you for the rest of your life based on how hard you work in the field. Mm-hmm. Oh, he's a good worker. Oh, your grandpapa, boy, he was a hard worker. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. And that is your worth as a human being in my traditional, narrow-minded Eastern North Carolina world. Mm-hmm. And the fat that you're having in the cream and the coffee, it's good to see that come back. I will say, if you don't do physical exercise or expose yourself to the weather and burn that off, you might end up. There's also another cultural maintenancing term. They're so fat you have to paint a stripe on their ass to see if they're walking or rolling.
Well,
so
turns. Well, I mean, this is a whole other conversation.
Yeah. We'll have to edit
about
this.
The human diet. Yeah. How are your editing skills?
It's all been cut.
Are we done?
We'll wrap it up.
Okay, we'll wrap.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's so great.
It's nice to have somebody to back talk off of, but when you live alone, it doesn't happen too often. Sometimes I get chatty but I've had tea, so I'm a little buzzed on that. So
yeah, what do you think about tea as opposed to coffee for conversation?
Oh, it's much better.
I've had people make that observation. I mean, a tea is the drink of diplomats and people that have social skills, and coffee is another thing.
Oh no! Well, I'm from the South. You have to have tea and rice. My culture is tea, rice, pork is okay, but tea. Oh, no tea? You must be poor. You don't have tea. What's wrong with you? Very English, very Scottish, very Chinese. There's more commonality between people in a southern home and the Chinese than any other two cultures I know.
Wow.
Ancestor worship, tea, hard work. You can't go to the bathroom without hitting 5 relatives on the way. Dense population and family, too much family.
Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
I was born in Tulsa.
In where?
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah. And I was there probably 6 or 7 years, and then we moved to a suburb of Chicago. My dad worked for the oil company, Exxon, Enco, Carter Oil.
1950s.
1950s. And I'm 65.
65.
We're in the same
era.
Basic era, yeah.
And then
Texas.
Yeah.
And then we lived in Houston for a long time. So, cosmopolitan city. I left there with an accent, but if I'm back, the southern
have a few
version,
drinks.
the Houston, southern Texas
Heart
version of the
out.
drawl shows up. But it's been a while, so that's it. And then I moved to Denver. Was there for 12 years, and I came here.
There's a lot of refugees coming in from Denver now. I just ran into one this weekend. He came up. He was not quite taken to the idea of not having electricity or heat in a shipping container, so he didn't stay but one night. But there are too many people in Denver. They're leaving. So.
God, that's such a funny. Okay. Oh, you want us? Well, maybe this is to be continued, or I don't know. But
I'll see you tomorrow. I'll maybe see you tonight. I mean, I haven't left yet.
That would be cool if you came, because
you need a
I
butler?
know you'd have a lot to contribute to the discussion.
Unfortunately, I had too much, but I'll try to keep my mouth shut to some degree.